Rain hammered the cafe window, blurring the city into a gray, weeping smear. But the real storm was at the table next to mine. I watched her hands, shaking, pale, dump the contents of a battered leather satchel onto the sticky table. Books, pens, a laptop covered in stickers, but not the one thing she needed. She was unraveling, right there in public. I know the texture of that panic. It's cold, sharp, and entirely isolating. She checked the side pocket again, fingers fumbling. Nothing. Her shoulders slumped, a devastating collapse of structure. The embassy was closed. It was Friday at 5. She was stranded. The coffee shop hummed with the aggressive cheerfulness of people safe from the weather, a stark contrast to the silent, freezing vacuum she sat in. Steam rose from wet wool coats, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and damp earth. I watched her for another 10 seconds, assessing the damage. Precision matters in my line of work. You have to know exactly when to step in before the deal falls through, or in this case, before the girl breaks. She was hyperventilating, shallow gasps that nobody else seemed to notice. I set my espresso down. The china clinked, a sharp sound that cut through the lo-fi jazz and the chatter. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. My heels clicked on the tile, a steady, deliberate rhythm against the chaotic drumming of the rain. "You're going to rip the lining if you check that pocket again," I said. My voice was low, pitched to carry only to her, cutting under the noise. She jumped. Her head snapped up. Wet strands of dark hair clung to her cheek. Her eyes were wide, hazel, and absolutely terrified. I can't find it." "The passport," I stated, not asking. "I had it. I swear I had it." She shoved a stack of index cards aside, her movements jerky. "I have a flight tonight. Oh God. Breathe." I pulled the chair out opposite her and sat. I didn't ask for permission. Authority is a posture. You assume it, and people naturally lean into it. "What's your name?" "Emily," she choked out, staring at me. "I'm Emily. I'm supposed to be in Berlin on Monday. The fellowship interview. It's the only chance I have." "Emily." I said it slowly, testing the weight of the syllables. "The embassy is closed until Monday morning. You know this." She stared at me, the reality hitting her like a physical blow. "Monday is too late. If I miss this flight, if I don't get there..." She looked down at her trembling hands. "My entire thesis, 3 years of work, it's gone." "It's not gone," I corrected her, my tone cool but firm. "It's delayed. There's a difference." I signaled the barista for water. Emily looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. She stopped seeing a generic stranger and saw the suit, the posture, the calm. I saw her too. Beneath the frantic energy of a grad student drowning in logistics, there was a fire, a desperate, intelligent intensity that she was struggling to contain. She wasn't just scared, she was furious at herself. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steadying just a fraction. "Someone who solves problems for a living," I said. "And someone who knows you can't fix this sitting in a wet coat in a coffee shop." The barista set the water down. Emily reached for it, her fingers brushing mine against the cold glass. The contact was brief, accidental, but the air charged instantly. A sudden, sharp awareness of proximity. It wasn't just charity. I felt a pull, undeniable and specific. I wanted to smooth that furrow between her brows, to take the weight of the crisis off her shoulders. "You have nowhere to go," I observed. It wasn't a question. "My sublet is gone. I turned in the keys this morning." She took a sip, the glass shaking against her teeth. "I'm effectively homeless in a thunderstorm." "My studio is 3 blocks away," I said. The offer hung there, heavy with implication. I watched her calculate. She was smart. She was assessing the risk against the desperate reality. "It's dry, it has Wi-Fi, and I have a phone that can reach people who don't answer general inquiries on weekends." She hesitated, biting her lip. "I can't impose. I don't even know you." "You can stay here and panic," I said, leaning in, resting my elbows on the table. "Or you can come with me, dry off, and we can strategize. I run a media firm, Emily. ideal in logistics and impossible deadlines. Let me help. She searched my face, unflinching. She was looking for a trap, but all she found was steady ground. The tension between us shifted from crisis to something else, a silent agreement. The vulnerability in her eyes deepened, and I felt a protective weight settle in my chest. It was a dangerous feeling, possessive and immediate. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." I stood up, extending a hand. "Let's go. The rain isn't stopping." She took my hand. Her grip was strong, desperate. As she stood, gathering her chaotic life into her bag, I knew the dynamic had already been set. She was the storm, and I was the shelter. And I had absolutely no intention of letting her walk back out into the rain alone. The wind hit us the moment we cleared the cafe vestibule, a physical force that nearly knocked the breath out of her. The city had turned hostile, the rain coming down in sheets that bounced off the pavement and soaked the hem of my trousers instantly. Emily shivered, a violent tremor that started in her shoulders and rattled down her spine. She looked small out here, the collar of her inadequate coat pulled up against a storm that didn't care about her deadline or her distress. I stepped closer, angling my body to block the worst of the gusts, shielding her with the wool of my coat and the certainty of my stance. I raised a hand, sharp and authoritative, and a taxi swerved toward us through the spray, tires hissing on the slick asphalt. I opened the door for her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking back at the street, at the fading light of the cafe, as if wondering if she was making a mistake. Then the cold bit harder, and she slid into the back seat. I followed, the door slamming shut and sealing us into a sudden, submerged silence. The interior of the cab smelled of old leather and damp synthetic fabric. It was intimate, far too intimate for two people who had been strangers 10 minutes ago. We sat close, the space demanding proximity. Every time the car cornered, the centrifugal force pressed her arm against mine. She was radiating a frantic heat, the kind that comes from adrenaline and pure, unadulterated stress. I kept my own body still, a counterweight to her vibration, but I was hyper-aware of the contact. The damp wool of her coat against my sleeve felt electric, a friction that sent a low hum of awareness through me. "I need to tell you," she started, her voice tight, staring straight ahead at the partition. "I don't do this. I don't follow strange women into taxis. I analyze variables. I write risk assessments. This is statistically unsound." I watched the neon lights of the city streak across her face, in jagged bursts of blue and red. The reflection made her look ethereal, fractured. "It's not unsound," I countered, my voice calm, filling the small space. "It's a pivot. Your original plan failed due to external factors. You're currently operating on a contingency basis. The variable you're struggling with is trust, not logic." She turned to look at me then, her eyes searching mine in the gloom. "And why should I trust you? You haven't even told me why you're doing this. People don't just help." "I do," I said, holding her gaze. "I see a system failing, and I fix it. Right now, you are the system." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the air thicken between us. And perhaps I prefer my Friday nights to have a little more substance than a solitary drink. It was a half-truth, framed in cool logic to bypass her defenses. But the subtext landed. I saw the flush rise on her neck, visible even in the dim light. She wasn't just a grad student in crisis. She was a woman, and she knew I was looking at her. The vulnerability in that realization was palpable. She slumped back against the seat, exhaling a breath she seemed to have been holding since the cafe. "Okay," she murmured, ceding control. "Contingency plan." I felt a surge of satisfaction, dark and possessive. She was letting me drive, literally and metaphorically. The ride continued in a charged silence, the only sound the rhythmic thumping of the wipers and the distant blare of horns. I found myself watching her hands, still clutching her bag, white-knuckled. I wanted to reach out and cover them, to ground her, but I held back. The tension was better this way, simmering, unspent. The taxi slowed, pulling up to the curb of a converted industrial building in the warehouse district. It wasn't a residential tower. It was heavy stone and steel, imposing and secure. I paid the driver and we stepped out. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but the wind was still biting. I guided her toward the heavy iron doors, keying in the code with practiced speed. The lock disengaged with a heavy, expensive thud. "Welcome to the bunker," I said, holding the door open. She stepped across the threshold, moving from the chaos of the street into the quiet, controlled atmosphere of the lobby. The air here was still and warm, smelling of polished concrete and silence. As the heavy door clicked shut behind us, locking out the world, I saw her shoulders finally drop. She was inside my perimeter now, safe, and entirely mine for the weekend. The elevator ride was a vertical transition, lifting us out of the city's chaotic dampness and into the rarefied air of the penthouse level. The machinery hummed, a low, expensive sound that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Emily stood in the corner of the steel cab, arms wrapped tight around her midsection, water dripping from the hem of her coat to create a dark constellation on the floor. She wouldn't look at me. She was staring at the numbers climbing, her breath fogging the mirrored surface just inches from her face. When the doors slid open, I led her into the sanctuary. My studio is a curated silence. It's an industrial loft, yes, with the requisite exposed brick and high ceilings, but I've softened the hard edges with intention. The lighting is low and amber, cast by vintage lamps that turn the space into a warm, enclosed world. The air here is always the same. Dry, still, and scented with the lingering ghost of espresso and the dust of old books. It's a space designed for focus, for the precision I apply to my work, and for the specific kind of solitude I usually crave. I locked the heavy steel door behind us. The sound was final, a solid thud followed by the slide of the deadbolt. It severed the connection to the storm outside. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was immediate and heavy with expectation. Emily stood just inside the threshold, afraid to move, afraid to touch. She looked like a shipwreck survivor, washed up on a very expensive beach. I watched her eyes dart around, taking in the landscape of my life. She clocked the wall of monitors, dark now, but clearly the nerve center of something significant. She saw the first edition prints framed in museum glass, the sprawling library ladder, the sheer scale of the furniture. "You said you run a firm," she said, her voice small in the cavernous room. She turned to me, water beading on her lashes. "You didn't say you were the firm." "I prefer to understate," I replied, slipping out of my own coat and hanging it on the rack. "It manages expectations." She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline of the transit wearing off to reveal the bone-deep cold of the rain. Her clothes were plastered to her skin, dark denim soaked through to a nearly black hue, her blouse clinging in a way that was objectively uncomfortable, but visually arresting. A puddle was forming around her boots, dark water seeping into the grain of the reclaimed hardwood. "I'm dripping," she whispered, looking down, horrified. "I'm ruining your floor." "The floor is sealed. It can handle a little water," I said, my voice dropping into that caretaker register that felt surprisingly natural. "You, however, are turning blue." I moved to the linen closet, my footsteps silent on the rugs, and pulled out a bath sheet. It was slate gray, heavy Egyptian cotton, the kind that feels like a weighted blanket. I walked back to her. She hadn't moved an inch. I didn't hand it to her. I opened it and draped it over her shoulders, pulling the ends together in front of her chest. For a moment, my hands lingered on the terry cloth, just inches from her collarbone. The proximity was sudden and sharp. I could smell the rain on her, ozone and wet wool, mixed with something warmer, something that was just her. She looked up at me, huddled into the towel, her eyes wide and unguarded. The unflinching attention I gave her wasn't polite. It was an assessment, a reading of her temperature and her trust. "Better?" I asked softly. "Warmer," she breathed. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then darted away, a flush rising on her pale cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the room. "Thank you for everything. This is insane. You don't even know me." "I'm learning," I said. I stepped back, giving her space, but keeping the connection taut. "But strategy requires a clear head, and you can't think when your teeth are chattering. We need to get you dry." I looked at her. Really looked at her. The towel was a temporary fix. The wet clothes underneath were a liability. and the thought of her in my space, wearing my things, sent a spike of possessive heat through me that I hadn't accounted for in my risk assessment. "You need to get out of those clothes," I stated, the logic irrefutable, the subtext thickening the air. "Immediately." "Go," I said, nodding toward the bathroom. It was a command, but soft. "The shower is stone, the water pressure is aggressive, and the soap is bergamot. Don't come out until the shivering stops." She looked at me, clutching the towel like armor. "Thank you." Again. "Stop thanking me. Just get warm." I watched the heavy door click shut, sealing her in with the steam. The moment the lock turned, the studio felt different. Empty, yet vibrating with her proximity. I turned and walked to my wardrobe area. It isn't a closet. It's an open-concept gallery of textiles, a row of organized monochrome that defines my public silhouette. I ran my fingers along the rack, bypassing the sharp blazers and the silk camisoles. I needed something that offered coverage but felt like an embrace. I paused at the dress shirts. My fingers lingered on a crisp white button-down. High thread count, structured collar, expensive. It was a shirt I wore to close deals, a piece of clothing that projected armor. Handing it to her felt significant, a deliberate blurring of the line between my professional exterior and this sudden, damp domesticity. I pulled it off the hanger. I grabbed a robe, too, a deep navy silk that felt like water against the skin. I walked back to the bathroom door. The sound of the shower was a steady hiss behind the wood. I knocked, a single rap of the knuckle. "Emily, open up just a crack." The water stopped. A moment later, the door opened an inch. Steam escaped, curling around the frame, carrying the scent of my own soap, spicy, rich, and now inextricably linked to her. A bare arm reached out. Her skin was flushed pink from the heat, wet droplets clinging to her wrist. "Here," I said, placing the stack of fabric into her damp palm. Our fingers brushed. The contact was brief, wet, and startlingly intimate. It wasn't just handing over cotton and silk. It was handing over a piece of my identity. I was dressing her in my life. "Thank you," she whispered, and the door closed again. I retreated to the kitchen island, leaning against the marble, waiting. I poured myself a glass of water, just to have something to hold. I found myself imagining the mechanics of it, her shedding the ruined, soaked denim, drying her skin with my towels, buttoning my shirt over her chest. The thought was intrusive, possessive, and entirely involuntary. I took a drink, forcing the coolness of the water to settle the heat rising in my chest. I deal in logic, in controlled variables, but there was no variable for this. The specific tension of a strange, beautiful woman wearing your clothes in your sanctuary while a storm rages outside. Then the door opened. She stepped out, and the air in the room seemed to stutter. The steam billowed around her like a soft focus lens, but the details were razor sharp. The shirt was massive on her. The shoulder seams hung halfway down her biceps, and the hem hit her mid-thigh, curved and crisp. She had rolled the sleeves up, but they were still loose, swallowing her hands. She hadn't tied the robe. It hung open, framing the white cotton, the dark silk contrasting with the stark brightness of the shirt. But it was the legs that undid me. Bare, pale, and impossibly long, ending in bare feet on my dark hardwood floors. There's a specific kind of vulnerability in seeing someone without their shoes, without the layers they present to the world. She looked stripped down, reset. I kept my face neutral, the boardroom mask, but my pulse hammered a different rhythm. She looked soft. She looked owned. She walked toward me, tugging self-consciously at the hem of the shirt. "I feel like a child playing dress-up," she said, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "I'm drowning in this." "You're not drowning," I said. My voice dropped an octave, rougher than I intended. I set my glass down. "You're recovering." She stopped a few feet away, sensing the shift in gravity. She looked up at me, her hair slicked back wet, exposing the clean, elegant line of her jaw. "It's a very nice shirt. I feel guilty wearing it. It feels expensive." "It is," I admitted, stepping into her space. I couldn't help it. The pull was magnetic. "But it looks stiff on the hanger. It needed—" I reached out, my hands hovering for a second, before I took the lapels of the robe and adjusted them, pulling the silk smoother over her shoulders. My knuckles grazed the cotton covering her collarbone. It needed life. She went still. Her breath hitched, a tiny, audible catch. She looked up at me, her hazel eyes wide, searching my face. The dynamic had pivoted. We weren't rescuer and victim anymore. We were two women standing in a dim room, the scent of bergamot and rain between us, the silence heavy with things we weren't saying. "You look better in it than I ever did," I murmured, the compliment landing with the weight of a stone in deep water. A flush rose from her chest, blooming red across her neck. She didn't look away. "I don't think that's true," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm glad you think so." The tension was a wire pulled tight, humming. If I leaned in, if I closed that final inch... But no, not yet. She was still vulnerable, still stranded. "Come," I said, stepping back and breaking the circuit with sheer willpower. "You need food. And wine. I have a bottle that needs to be opened, and I suspect you need a drink as much as I do." Cooking for me is an exercise in controlled chaos. I don't follow recipes. I understand chemistry, and I understand heat. I moved around the kitchen island, a slab of honed volcanic stone that cost more than my first car, with the same economy of motion I use in a boardroom. I wasn't just making dinner. I was reestablishing the parameters of the evening. I needed to shift the energy from rescue mission to something more balanced, more reciprocal. I pulled a cast iron skillet from the rack, the metal heavy and cold in my hand. I set it over a high flame. I chopped garlic, the knife hitting the wooden board in a rapid, rhythmic staccato that echoed in the high ceilings of the loft. Tap, 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 tap. Precise. Unforgiving. I could feel Emily watching me from the other side of the island. She was leaning against the stone, wrapped in my robe, clutching the glass of water like a lifeline. She was lulled by the competence on display, her eyes tracking the movement of the knife, the flare of the gas burner, the way I tossed fresh herbs into the oil. The scent of rosemary and searing garlic hit the air instantly, aggressive and grounding, cutting through the damp, metallic smell of the storm. "You're very efficient," she observed, her voice soft, competing with the hiss of the pan. "Inefficiency offends me," I replied without looking up, flipping a steak with tongs. "Time is the only asset you can't leverage." I reached for the wine. I'd chosen a heavy, complex red, a Barolo that needed time to breathe, much like us. I poured 2 glasses, the liquid dark and velvety against the crystal. I slid one across the stone toward her. She reached for it. Our timing was off, or perhaps perfectly on. Her fingers brushed mine as she took the stem. It wasn't a graze, it was a collision of temperatures. Her skin was still cool from the rain, mine hot from the stove. The contact lingered for a heartbeat too long, a silent acknowledgement of the electricity humming under the domestic surface. "To contingency plans," I toasted, lifting my glass. "To dry clothes," she countered, taking a sip. She closed her eyes as the wine hit her tongue. "Oh, that is serious wine." "I don't believe in unserious things," I said, plating the food. "Now tell me, the thesis, the one worth risking hypothermia for. What is so vital about it that you are unraveling in a coffee shop?" She hesitated, setting the glass down. It sounds dry when I say it out loud. Try me. I have a high tolerance for dryness. "It's about the intersection of digital memory and physical displacement in post-conflict urban spaces," she recited, the academic armor sliding back into place. "Specifically, how we curate history when the physical architecture is destroyed." I leaned against the counter, crossing my ankles, studying her. "So, you write about buildings that aren't there anymore." "I write about the ghosts people refuse to see," she corrected, a little sharper. "It sounds poetic," I challenged, swirling my wine. "But is it practical? You're spending 3 years analyzing voids. Does that actually change the landscape, or is it just nostalgia dressed up in footnotes?" I saw it then, the spark. Her spine straightened inside the oversized shirt. Her eyes narrowed, the hazel turning dark and fierce. She wasn't the stranded girl anymore. She was the expert, and I had just stepped on her turf. "It's not nostalgia," she said, her voice dropping, steady and hard. "It's accountability. If we don't document the void, the erasure becomes permanent. You work in media. You, of all people, should know that if it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. I'm not writing about empty space. I'm writing about the evidence of existence." The fire in her voice delighted me. It was visceral. She pushed back against my cynicism, not with defensiveness, but with conviction. She had teeth. "Touché," I murmured, hiding a smile behind the rim of my glass. I stand corrected. The tension in the room shifted again, deepening. The smell of the food, the warmth of the wine, the relentless drumming of the rain against the dark windows, it all conspired to create a bubble of intimacy. We ate standing up at the island, the silence between us no longer awkward, but charged with a new, intellectual respect. "Let's move," I said, picking up the bottle. The couch is more forgiving than the bar stools. The living area of my studio is dominated by a couch that is less a piece of furniture and more a landscape. 10 feet of deep, midnight blue velvet, low to the ground and dangerously comfortable. It's a piece designed for lounging, for long nights and loose conversations. I moved to the far end, kicking off my heels and tucking my legs under me, sinking into the plush fabric. I watched Emily hesitate. There's a specific intimacy to a couch like this. Once you sit, you are committed to the gravity of the cushions. She chose the opposite end, maintaining a polite, safe distance of about 3 feet. She curled her legs up, the hem of my white shirt riding up her thigh, the navy silk robe pooling around her like water. I put a record on, Coltrane, Blue and Green, and the melancholic, smoky saxophone drifted through the room, mingling with the steady rhythm of the rain against the glass. The atmosphere shifted from the sharp, bright energy of the kitchen to something darker, slower, and infinitely more charged. "So," she started, turning her body to face me, resting her arm on the back of the couch. She looked comfortable now, the wine flushing her cheeks, the fear from the cafe completely dissolved. "You dismantle problems. You run a media firm. You have a studio that looks like it belongs in Architectural Digest. What is the actual job? Because logistics feels like a euphemism." "I manage narratives," I said, swirling the last of the Barolo in my glass. "When a story breaks that shouldn't, or when a client needs to be seen in a specific light, I architect the perspective. I don't change the facts. I just adjust the lighting." "You manipulate the truth," she challenged, a playful glint in her eyes. "You're a professional liar." "I'm a professional editor," I corrected, leaning my head back against the velvet. "There is no such thing as objective truth, Emily, especially not in your field. You curate history. You decide which ghosts are worth recording. That's an editorial choice. You and I do the same thing. I just get paid better for it, and my deadlines are in hours, not semesters." She laughed, a low, throaty sound that surprised me. It wasn't the polite laugh of a guest. It was the genuine amusement of an equal. That is the most cynical justification for spin I have ever heard. But, she paused, tilting her head, studying me with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. "I suspect you're actually very good at it. You have a way of making control feel like safety." The comment landed with precision. I felt a flicker of heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the wine. She was seeing past the suit, past the loft, right into the machinery of how I operated. "Control is safety," I murmured. "Chaos is just failure of imagination." "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. The playfulness vanished, replaced by a soft, probing curiosity. She leaned in, closing the distance between us by mere inches, but the shift felt seismic. "Because I was chaos? Because I was a disorderly element in your city?" "You were a variable in distress," I said, dodging the emotional core of the question. "And I hate wasted potential." "I don't believe you," she said softly. "No?" "No," she shook her head, a strand of damp hair falling over her eyes. She brushed it back, a gesture so unselfconscious and graceful it made my breath catch. "I think you saw someone drowning, and I think, under all this," she gestured to the room, to the walls of books, to my perfectly tailored existence, "I think you like being the one who holds the lifeline." I stared at her. She was dissecting me with the same academic rigor she applied to her thesis, peeling back the layers of my carefully constructed persona. And the terrifying part was, I liked it. I liked being seen by her. "You're dangerous," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm just a grad student in a borrowed shirt," she countered, but her smile was knowing. The debate fell away. The intellectual sparring match had served its purpose. It had burned off the awkwardness, established our footing, and brought us here, to this silence. The jazz played on, a slow, winding trumpet solo, but the room felt silent. The distance between us on the couch, those 3 safe feet, suddenly felt like a canyon we were both leaning over. I looked at her, the softness of her mouth, the intelligence in her eyes, the way the oversized collar of my shirt framed her neck. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to bridge the gap, to trace the line of her jaw with my thumb, to see if her skin felt as soft as it looked. The pull was physical, a magnetic drag in the center of my chest. I saw her gaze drop to my lips, then snap back up to my eyes, her pupils blown wide. She felt it too. The air was thick with it, heavy and electric. For a long moment, nobody moved. We just existed in the tension, letting it coil tighter and tighter. It was a precipice. One move, one touch, and the night would fracture into something else entirely. Then, the record ended. The needle hissed in the groove, the sudden absence of music crashing into the room like a wave. I blinked, breaking the trance. I glanced at the vintage clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. The adrenaline of the rescue and the wine had masked the exhaustion, but now it hit me, and with it, the logistical reality of the night. "It's late," I said, my voice sounding rough to my own ears. "It is," she agreed, though she didn't move. "We need to sleep," I stated, the logic returning to save me from the impulse to pull her across the velvet. "And we have a logistical problem to solve regarding the furniture." "The problem with open-concept living," I said, standing and smoothing the lines of my trousers, "is that it prioritizes aesthetic flow over traditional privacy." I gestured to the vast, singular space of the loft. There is exactly one bed, and while this couch is Italian velvet and cost a fortune, it is designed for cocktails and posture, not REM cycles. Emily looked at the bed. It was a statement piece, a low, sprawling platform covered in charcoal linen, sitting on a raised dais like a modern altar. Then she looked back at the couch, calculating. "I can take the couch," she offered quickly, the politeness of a well-raised guest warring with the exhaustion in her eyes. "Really, I've slept in library carols and airport terminals. This is luxury compared to that." "Absolutely not," I countered, my voice leaving no room for argument. "I don't host guests by putting them on furniture that will ruin their spinal alignment. You've had a crisis. You need actual rest, not a nap." "So, you take the couch?" She raised an eyebrow, a faint challenge returning. "I am 34 years old, and I own the deed to this building," I said dryly, moving to clear the throw pillows. "I don't sleep on couches in my own home." The silence stretched, the implication landing between us with a soft thud. There was only one option left. "It's a California king," I added, framing it as a spatial statistic rather than an invitation. "It's roughly the size of a small European country. We can stay on opposite coastlines. You won't even know I'm there." She bit her lip, looking at the expanse of dark linen. The logic held, even if the propriety was thin. "Okay," she conceded. "Logistics. Opposite coastlines. Strictly territorial," I agreed. I moved to the wall panel. "I'm killing the lights." I slid the dimmer down. The warm amber glow of the studio collapsed, swallowed by the sudden rush of shadows. But it wasn't pitch black. The floor-to-ceiling windows, lashed by the relentless rain, let in the ambient bleed of the city, a diffuse, steely blue light that turned the room into a monochrome photograph. The rain shadows ran down the walls like living ink, moving in time with the storm. Emily stood by the side of the bed, a pale ghost in my white shirt. The darkness made the intimacy sharper, stripping away the social cues of the lit room. In the light, we were two professionals managing a situation. In the dark, we were just bodies in a room. "Do you need anything else?" I asked, my voice naturally dropping lower in the dark. "No," she whispered. "I'm good." I walked to my side of the bed, the east coast of our arrangement. I stripped off my blazer, draping it over a chair with deliberate care. I hesitated, then unbuttoned my cuffs, rolling them up. I kept my camisole and trousers on, a necessary layer of armor. I wasn't stripping down. Not tonight. The risk was too high. We climbed in simultaneously, a synchronized domestic movement that felt bizarrely natural for two strangers. The mattress was firm, high-density memory foam that absorbed the weight without bouncing, but I still felt the shift. The bed, despite my claims of it being a country, felt suddenly finite. She stayed rigidly on her edge, pulling the duvet up to her chin, creating a wall of fabric. I lay on my back, staring at the exposed ductwork on the ceiling, illuminated by a passing headlight that swept across the room like a searchlight. "Good night, Emily," I said into the dark. "Good night." The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized. I could hear her breathing, shallow, uneven. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, drifting across the expanse of linen to reach me. It was maddening. My senses, usually disciplined and directed toward business, were rioting. I was hyper-aware of the friction of the sheets, the scent of her shampoo, my shampoo, wafting from the pillow next to mine, the knowledge that just 2 feet away, she was lying there, in my shirt, bare-legged. I closed my eyes, but the image of her in the bathroom door burned behind my lids. The vulnerability, the trust, the way she had looked at me on the couch. I wanted to reach out. The impulse was a physical ache in my palm. I wanted to slide my hand across the cool linen until I found her warmth. I wanted to know if she was asleep, or if she was lying there staring at the ceiling too, wondering about the stranger who had pulled her out of the rain. I felt a protective, possessive weight settling in, warring with the logic I prided myself on. But I didn't move. I lay perfectly still, a statue of restraint, listening to the rain and the soft, rhythmic sound of the woman beside me breathing, letting the slow burn of the night settle deep into my bones. 3 a.m. is a specific kind of country. It has its own laws, its own gravity, and its own brutal honesty. The rain had settled into a monotonous, weeping rhythm against the glass, no longer a storm, but a persistent, soaking reality. I hadn't slept. I was lying perfectly still, eyes adjusted to the gloom, watching the way the city lights filtered through the water on the window, casting rippling, blue-gray shadows across the ceiling. It looked like we were underwater. Beside me, the coastline I had established was eroding. Emily was restless. I could feel the minute shifts in the mattress, the tension in the linen every time she adjusted her legs. She wasn't tossing and turning. She was vibrating with the same frequency of anxiety that had nearly shattered her in the cafe. The heat radiating from her was a physical presence, a warm front colliding with my cool restraint. "You're thinking so loud I can't hear the rain," I whispered into the dark. The rustling stopped instantly. A beat of silence, heavy and thick. Then, a sigh that sounded like a building collapsing. "I'm sorry," she whispered back. Her voice was rough, stripped of the social polish she'd tried to maintain earlier. I can't turn my brain off. I keep replaying the moment I reached into my bag and felt nothing. "Stop," I said. "The passport is a solvable variable. Monday comes, we go to the embassy, you get an emergency document. It's paperwork, Emily, not a Greek tragedy. It's not the passport." The admission hung in the air, fragile. This was the midnight truth. The darkness acts as a confessional. It strips away the need for eye contact, for posturing. You can say things to a ceiling that you can't say to a face. I turned my head on the pillow. All I could see was the dark shape of her, a mound of duvet, and the pale blur of her face. "Then what is it?" "It's the fellowship," she confessed, the words tumbling out now. "I've spent 3 years working toward this interview. 3 years of research, of fighting for grants, of convincing everyone I'm brilliant. But when I realized the passport was gone, I felt relief." She paused, the shame distinct in her tone. For a split second, before the panic hit, I felt relieved that I wouldn't have to go, that I wouldn't have to walk into that room in Berlin and prove I belong there. Because I don't think I do. "Imposter syndrome," I diagnosed softly. "It's boring, Emily. Everyone has it. The CEO of my biggest client threw up in my private bathroom before a shareholder meeting last week. Fear isn't an indicator of incompetence. It's an indicator of stakes." "It feels like a warning," she murmured. "Like the universe is trying to tell me I'm on the wrong path." "The universe is indifferent," I countered, shifting my body. The movement was instinctive. I turned onto my side, facing her. "It's raining because of atmospheric pressure, not because of your thesis. You lost your passport because you were distracted, not because of fate. You were looking for a sign to quit because it's easier than risking failure. But I've seen you fight. I saw you in the kitchen. You have teeth, Emily. You just forgot how to bite." The sheets rustled. she turned to. Suddenly, the vast expanse of the quote-unquote California king vanished. We were facing each other in the blue-lit dark, the distance between our faces less than a foot. I could see the glint of her eyes, searching mine. The proximity was overwhelming. The scent of her, warm skin, my soap, the faint metallic tang of the night, filled my lungs. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. "You strip everything down to mechanics." "Mechanics work," I said. "Emotions are messy. Structure is reliable." "Is that what this is?" She moved her hand, and I felt her fingers graze the pillowcase just inches from my cheek. "Structure? This is..." I faltered. My logic was failing. The variables were rioting. "This is shelter." She shifted closer. The space between us was charged, electric. I could feel her breath, warm and uneven, ghosting across my lips. The vulnerability she had laid bare demanded a response that wasn't clinical. She needed to be anchored. I reached out. My hand moved through the dark, crossing the treaty line we'd drawn. My fingers brushed the hair back from her temple, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. The contact was a spark. Her skin was incredibly soft, fever warm against my cool fingertips. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut. "You aren't a fraud, Emily," I murmured, my thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You're just tired. And you're terrified. But on Monday, I will drive you to the embassy. I will put you on a plane. And you will go to Berlin and tear that interview apart. Because I don't invest in bad assets." She let out a shaky breath, her hand coming up to catch my wrist. She held it there, pressing my palm against her face. It was an intimacy that bypassed the physical and went straight to the bone. "Thank you," she breathed. We stayed like that, hovering on the precipice. I could have kissed her. The angle was right, the pull was undeniable. I wanted to. I wanted to close that final inch and taste the relief on her mouth. But the timing was wrong. She was vulnerable, and I was the one with the power. To cross that line now would be to break the trust I'd just built. So I held the tension. I let it burn, a slow, exquisite ache in my chest. "Sleep," I ordered softly, though my voice lacked its usual command. "Okay," she whispered. She didn't let go of my hand. She adjusted her pillow, settling down, but kept her fingers laced loosely around my wrist, anchoring herself to me. I watched her breathing slow, watched the tension drain from her frame as sleep finally pulled her under. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling the electric weight of her touch, knowing that come morning, the logic of the daylight would change everything. Sunlight hit the loft like a revelation. It wasn't the gray, filtered light of the storm anymore. It was sharp, unapologetic morning gold that sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I woke up to the silence of it. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city outside scrubbed clean and glistening. I reached out instinctively. The space beside me on the vast mattress was empty, the charcoal linen cool to the touch, but the pillow still held the faint indentation of her head and the lingering scent of bergamot. I wasn't panicked. There was a steady, rhythmic sound coming from the kitchen, the mechanical whir of the grinder, the heavy tamp of the portafilter against the counter, the hiss of steam. It was the sound of my morning routine, precise and calibrated, but I wasn't the one doing it. I got up, pulling on my silk robe and tying the sash tight, grounding myself in the ritual. Walking out into the main space felt different today. The shadows were gone. The loft was bright, exposing every corner, but it didn't feel vulnerable. It felt properly lived in. Emily was at the espresso machine. She was still wearing my white shirt, the fabric rumpled now, creased from sleep and warmth, the top button undone. She had found a pair of thick wool socks from my drawer, gray cashmere, and was sliding slightly across the polished floor as she moved between the grinder and the sink. She looked ridiculous and entirely perfect. She looked like she had been standing in my kitchen for years, inhabiting my space with a casual grace that dismantled my defenses. "You know how to operate a La Marzocco," I said, leaning against the doorframe, my voice husky with sleep. She didn't jump this time. She turned, a mug in her hand, steam curling up around her face in the sunbeams. Her hair was a mess, a dark, tangled halo of bedhead that made my fingers itch to smooth it down. "I told you, I'm a grad student. Caffeine is the only variable I can control with absolute precision. She slid the mug across the volcanic stone island toward me. It was perfect. The crema was thick, hazelnut-colored, unbroken. I took a sip. It was rich, hot, and frankly, better than I made it. Acceptable? She asked, a tease in her voice, leaning her hip against the counter. Dangerous, I corrected, holding her gaze over the rim. You're making yourself indispensable. And that is a risky strategy with someone who doesn't like to let go of good assets. We stood there in the quiet of the morning, the city humming below us, the light warming the hardwood. The frantic energy of last night, the tears, the panic, the midnight confessions in the dark, had evaporated with the rain. What was left was this, a quiet, steady hum of domesticity that felt terrifyingly natural. The embassy opens in 2 hours, I said, checking the time on the microwave display. We can get you that emergency travel document. You can be on a flight by tonight. The words hung there. It was the solution we had fought for. It was the fix. But neither of us moved. Emily looked down into her coffee, swirling the dark liquid. The relief I expected to see wasn't there. Instead, there was a hesitation, a reluctance that mirrored the heavy, anchoring weight in my own chest. I suppose I should pack, she said, but she didn't move toward her bag. Get back to the real world. Berlin. The interview. The interview is Monday, I reminded her, setting my mug down. Today is Saturday, and the airlines are still clearing the backlog from the storm. I walked around the island. I moved into her space, not with the urgency of the rescue or the tension of the night, but with a calm, deliberate claim. I stopped in front of her. She looked up, her eyes clear in the morning light, stripped of the fear. You don't have to rush, I said. The studio is quiet on weekends. The light is good for reading. And I have a feeling you haven't finished arguing with me about the ethics of archival history. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, soft and genuine. Are you offering me a refuge, or are you just looking for another debate? I'm offering you breakfast, I said, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. A callback to the darkness, but now in the brave, bright light of day. My thumb lingered on her jawline. And I'm suggesting that perhaps the universe didn't steal your passport to punish you. Maybe it just wanted you to stop running long enough to be found. She leaned into my touch, her cheek warm against my palm, her eyes closing briefly. I think I'd like that, she whispered, opening her eyes to look at me with unflinching clarity. Staying. It wasn't a promise of forever. We were barely 24 hours in. But it was a start. The crisis was over, but the story was just beginning. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us an hour later. But this time, we were on the same side of it. We walked out into the crisp, rain-washed city, shoulder to shoulder, heading toward the embassy not as rescuer and victim, but as partners. The chaos had finally cleared, leaving only the undeniable clarity of the connection forged between us. If you've ever found clarity in the middle of a storm, subscribe for more stories.